Why would a nation enter the greatest conflict in human history without the weapon everyone said would win it? Between 1933 and 1939, while Britain built Lancasters and America designed flying fortresses, Germany created an air force without four-engine strategic bombers. This absence would haunt German cities throughout the war as Allied heavy bombers reduced them to rubble, while the Luftwaffe could only watch helplessly. Nazi propaganda later claimed sabotage or treachery, but the truth reveals something far more complex. Germany's failure to develop long-range heavy bombers wasn't stupidity, but the logical outcome of historical restrictions, distinctive military doctrine, technological limitations and strategic assumptions that seemed perfectly rational until they proved catastrophically wrong. This is among the most contentious questions in military aviation history, requiring us to journey through abstract doctrinal theory to understand concrete weapons development decisions. The answer begins not in the 1930s with Hitler's rearmament, but in 1919 with Germany's crushing defeat and the treaty that would shape its aviation future for nearly 2 decades. The Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919, didn't just limit German aviation, it attempted to eliminate it entirely. Article 198 stated with brutal clarity that the armed forces of Germany must not include any military or naval air forces. The treaty allowed Germany exactly 100 seaplanes for minesweeping duties only, explicitly forbidden from carrying arms, munitions or bombs of any nature. No dirigibles could be kept. Within 2 months of the treaty taking effect, all German Air Force personnel were required to be demobilized. For 6 months following the treaty, manufacturing and importation of aircraft, parts, engines and components were completely forbidden across all German territory. These restrictions devastated German aeronautical development. While Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union spent the 1920s advancing aircraft design, engine technology, and operational doctrine through continuous military aviation programs, Germany fell desperately behind. The aircraft industry that had produced some of the war's finest fighters was systematically dismantled. Experienced designers emigrated or shifted to other industries. Manufacturing facilities were destroyed or converted. The institutional knowledge that had made German aviation formidable simply evaporated. Germany did attempt covert development. Secret cooperation with the Soviet Union at Lipetsk allowed limited pilot training and tactical experimentation from 1926 onward. Designers worked abroad, particularly in Sweden, Japan, and the Netherlands, developing aircraft that could theoretically be adapted for military use later. But these efforts were fragmentary, underfunded, and conducted under constant fear of Allied discovery. By 1926, when some restrictions were finally relaxed, German aviation had lost nearly a decade of development time it would never recover. During this period of enforced aviation exile, German military theorists studied international air power doctrine with the intensity of students who couldn't practice but could only learn. They examined the writings of Italian theorist Giulio Douhet, whose 1921 book, The Command of the Air, argued that future wars would be won by strategic bombing of enemy cities and industry. They studied British Air Marshal Hugh Trenchard's advocacy for independent air power and strategic bombing as the decisive arm. They analysed American Brigadier General Billy Mitchell's demonstrations showing bombers could sink battleships, and his arguments that the bomber would always get through enemy defences. But German theorists rejected these doctrines. The reasons were both practical and philosophical. Germany's geographic position in Central Europe, surrounded by potential enemies, made the nation uniquely vulnerable to air attack. French bombers could reach German industrial centres within minutes of war's outbreak. Unlike Britain, protected by the Channel, or America, protected by oceans, Germany couldn't afford to trade strategic bombing attacks. Any German bomber striking Paris would be matched by French bombers over Berlin, and Germany's industrial capacity couldn't sustain such mutual destruction. Additionally, German military culture remained army-centric. The army had nearly achieved victory in 1918 before collapse at home. To army leaders, aviation existed to support ground operations, not conduct independent campaigns. This army-first mentality would shape all Luftwaffe development, ensuring air power remained tethered to ground force support rather than independent strategic missions. When the Nazi regime came to power in January 1933, German military aviation essentially didn't exist. The covert forces numbered perhaps 2,000 personnel, with no operational bomber force whatsoever. By early 1934, Germany possessed approximately 30 bombers, mostly inadequate designs like the WW2 or converted Junkers Ju-52 transports, originally designed for civil aviation. These aircraft could barely be called military weapons. The Do-11 was underpowered, unstable, and struggled to carry meaningful bomb loads. The Ju-52 transport pressed into bomber service was laughably vulnerable with its corrugated metal skin and fixed landing gear. But military planners in Berlin weren't thinking about strategic bombing of distant targets. Their entire focus centered on regional threats from immediate neighbors. France remained the primary concern, possessing the continent's largest air force and army. Poland to the east had grown into a substantial military power backed by French alliance. Belgium controlled territory necessary for any Western offensive. Czechoslovakia possessed a modern military and bordered German territory. For operations against these neighbours, medium-range bombers seemed perfectly adequate. Why invest in expensive four-engine bombers with 1,000-mile ranges when your enemies were 300 miles away? Between 1933 and 1935, German aviation underwent explosive growth despite starting from nearly nothing. The workforce expanded from several thousand to over 50 times that number by 1938. New factories were constructed, design bureaus were established, foreign expertise was acquired, but this growth occurred under severe constraints. Germany lacked the aluminum production capacity of Britain or America. Skilled aviation workers were scarce. Manufacturing infrastructure had to be built from scratch. Engine technology lagged behind foreign developments by several years. In this environment of rapid expansion from a position of weakness, German planners made pragmatic choices. They prioritized designs that could enter production quickly, using available technology and industrial capacity. Twin-engine medium bombers like the Heinkel HE-111 and Dornier Do-17 fit this requirement. They used engines Germany could actually produce. They required airfields Germany possessed. They could be manufactured in facilities that existed. Most importantly, they could be deployed within 2 years rather than the 5 to 7 years four-engine heavy bombers would require. The appointment of General Walter Wever as Luftwaffe Chief of Staff in 1933 brought Germany its one opportunity for strategic bombing development. Wever, unlike most German officers, understood air power's independent potential. He studied Douai and Trenchard seriously rather than dismissively. Most critically, he recognized that Germany's likely ultimate enemy, the Soviet Union, possessed industrial capacity buried deep in the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of twin-engine bombers operating from German bases. Wever initiated the Ural bomber program in 1934, secretly requesting designs from Dornier and Junkers for long-range heavy bombers capable of striking Soviet industry 1,500 miles from German territory. The specifications called for aircraft carrying 1.5 tons of bombs over 1,200 miles, roughly equivalent to early American and British heavy bomber concepts. Dornier responded with the Do-19 design. Junkers countered with the Ju-89. Both were four-engine aircraft with crews of 9, designed for strategic bombing missions. Prototypes were ordered in 1935. Development proceeded slowly due to engine problems, structural issues, and the general inexperience of German industry with aircraft of this size. The Do-19 first flew in October 1936, powered by 4 underpowered radial engines producing just 650 horsepower each. Performance was disappointing. Speed barely exceeded 200 miles per hour. Service ceiling was inadequate. Range fell short of requirements. The Ju-89 performed somewhat better, but still failed to meet specifications. But these technical problems might have been overcome given time and resources. The fatal blow came not from engineering failure, but from human mortality. On June 3, 1936, General Wever died in a flying accident at Dresden. His Heinkel HE-70 crashed on takeoff when the pilot forgot to remove the control locks, killing Wever instantly. With him died Germany's strategic bombing vision. Wever's successors, particularly Albert Kesselring and Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, were army cooperation advocates who viewed strategic bombing as wasteful diversion from the Luftwaffe's true mission supporting ground forces. They cancelled the Ural bomber program in April 1937, arguing that resources should focus on proven medium bomber designs rather than experimental heavy bombers that wouldn't be operational for years, but doctrinal issues beyond Weber's death doomed German heavy bomber development. In 1935, the Luftwaffe codified its operational doctrine in a manual called Luftwaffe Dienstvorschrift 16, titled Luftkriegführung, or Conduct of the Air War. This document would remain essentially unchanged throughout World War II, serving as the intellectual foundation for all Luftwaffe operations. Luftwaffe Dienstvorschrift 16 rejected strategic bombing as primary mission. Instead, it established a hierarchy of air power objectives. First priority was achieving air superiority by destroying enemy air forces on the ground and in combat. Second priority was supporting ground and naval forces through tactical bombing, reconnaissance, and close air support. Only third came strategic bombing of enemy war industry and infrastructure, and even this was defined as attacking aircraft factories and supply systems rather than pure strategic bombing of cities or distant industry. This operational philosophy reflected uniquely German military thinking. Unlike Britain's Royal Air Force, which fought for independence from Army and Navy control, or America's Army Air Corps, which sought to prove strategic bombing could win wars alone, the Luftwaffe saw itself as one component of combined arms warfare. Air superiority enabled ground offensives. Ground offensives captured airfields closer to new targets. This operational approach, conducted in theatre rather than strategically, required flexible medium bombers, not specialised heavy bombers. Additionally, German theorists believed they'd identified fatal flaws in strategic bombing doctrine. Heavy bombers were expensive, costing perhaps 3 times what medium bombers cost. They required longer runways and more complex support infrastructure. They were less manoeuvrable and more vulnerable to fighter attack. Most critically, German analysis of bombing accuracy suggested that high-altitude bombing from 20,000 feet or more was wildly inaccurate. In an era before radar bombing aids or computing bomb sites, most bombs dropped from high altitude missed targets by hundreds of yards. If accuracy was poor, why invest in expensive bombers carrying large loads when cheaper bombers carrying smaller loads could achieve similar results through greater numbers? A remarkable 1939 German Air Ministry document analysing heavy bomber characteristics survives in captured records. It lists systematic disadvantages. Reduced speed compared to medium bombers required more defensive armament, adding weight that reduced bomb load and range. Large size required extensive airfield facilities that were difficult to construct and easy for enemies to target. Spare parts. Logistics became nightmarishly complex with 4 engines instead of 2. Poor manoeuvrability made heavy bombers vulnerable to fighter attack. Questionable bombing accuracy from high altitude meant tonnage dropped didn't correlate to damage inflicted. These concerns weren't irrational given 1937 technology and doctrine. Early British and American heavy bombers did suffer from these problems. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress in its early variants was vulnerable, inaccurate, and suffered heavy losses. British Wellington and Whitley bombers achieved poor accuracy in early war night raids. German skepticism about heavy bombers had evidence supporting it. By 1938, however, German strategic assumptions began unravelling. The Munich crisis revealed that Germany might face Britain and France rather than Poland alone. The possibility of war with Britain introduced a target Germany's existing bombers couldn't effectively reach. From German bases, the Heinkel SG-111 and Dornier Du-17 could barely reach London with minimal bomb loads. They couldn't reach British industrial centres in the Midlands at all. Scotland was completely beyond range. German planners belatedly recognised they needed long-range bombers. In November 1938, specifications were issued for a new heavy bomber programme. Heinkel responded with the HE-177 design, a large twin-engine aircraft using an unusual configuration of paired engines driving single propellers. This arrangement was supposed to reduce drag while providing 4-engine power. Arado submitted the Arado 240 design. Junkers proposed the Ju-288, but these programs faced impossible timelines. The specifications demanded aircraft capable of carrying 2 tons of bombs, 1,000 miles while being able to dive bomb with precision, an aerodynamically contradictory requirement that crippled development. The HE-177's paired engine configuration proved disastrous. Cooling problems caused constant engine fires. The aircraft became known as the Flaming Coffin among crews. Despite years of development and thousands of man-hours, the HE-177 never became a reliable combat aircraft. Industrial capacity limitations compounded doctrinal problems. By 1939, German aircraft industry employed approximately 250,000 workers, impressive growth from the 1933 starting point of essentially zero. But this workforce was already fully committed to existing programs. Producing Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, Heinkel He-1 11 medium bombers, Dornier Do-17 reconnaissance bombers, Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, and training aircraft consumed all available capacity. Adding heavy bomber production would require building new factories, training new workers, and diverting aluminum and engines from existing programs. Germany's aluminum production provides instructive comparison. In 1939, German aluminum production reached approximately 200,000 tons annually. Britain produced approximately 24,000 tons but could import unlimited quantities from Canada and America. The United States produced over 160,000 tons with capacity to rapidly expand. For Germany, every ton of aluminum allocated to heavy bombers was a ton unavailable for fighters, medium bombers, or other aircraft. Engine production revealed similar constraints. Germany's most powerful operational bomber engine in 1939 was the Junkers Jumo 211, producing roughly 1,200 horsepower. Heavy bombers required engines producing 1,800 to 2,000 horsepower. Developing such engines required years of research into metallurgy, supercharging, and fuel systems. Germany's limited high-octane fuel production further constrained high-performance engine development. Without engines, heavy bomber programs remained paper exercises. When war began in September 1939, Germany possessed no modern four-engine heavy bomber force. But neither did most other nations. America's Boeing B-17 existed in small numbers, with early variants suffering from defensive armament and operational problems. Britain's Short Stirling and Handley Page Halifax were just entering service, untested in combat. The Avro Lancaster, which would become Britain's most effective heavy bomber, wouldn't fly until January 1941. Even the Soviet Union, whose industrial capacity Germany feared, had only primitive heavy bombers like the Petlyakov PE-8 in tiny numbers. The critical difference wasn't operational heavy bombers in September 1939, but programs ready for mass production. Britain had established bomber production infrastructure and doctrine. America was designing heavy bombers with knowledge they'd be needed. The Soviet Union was developing multiple heavy bomber types. Germany had the troubled He-177 program that wouldn't produce reliable aircraft until far too late, if ever. The 1940 Western Campaign validated German doctrine, or seemed to. Medium bombers supporting army advances achieved spectacular success. The Luftwaffe destroyed French and British air forces on the ground through airfield attacks, precisely as doctrine prescribed. Close air support shattered Allied defensive lines. France fell in 6 weeks. German officers congratulated themselves on avoiding the expensive strategic bombing dead end. The Battle of Britain shattered these illusions. Suddenly Germany needed to attack an island nation whose industry was beyond medium bomber range from available bases. The Luftwaffe attempted strategic bombing with aircraft designed for tactical missions. Heinkel, He-111s and Dornier Do-17s, reaching London carried bomb loads measured in hundreds of pounds rather than tons. They suffered appalling losses to British fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The campaign failed completely, proving German medium bombers couldn't conduct strategic missions against prepared defences. By 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the bomber gap became strategic catastrophe. Soviet industry evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains was completely safe from German attack. American industry 3,000 miles across the Atlantic might as well have been on the moon. Meanwhile, British and American heavy bombers were entering production in enormous numbers, preparing to reduce German cities to ruins while the Luftwaffe could only respond with inadequate reprisal raids using inappropriate aircraft. German leaders recognized the mistake too late. Albert Speer, armaments minister from 1942 onward, repeatedly pleaded for heavy bomber development. Hermann Göring, Luftwaffe commander, demanded miracles from designers and industry. Adolf Hitler raged about strategic bombing failures, but industrial capacity didn't exist to produce heavy bombers in meaningful numbers while maintaining fighter production. The He-177 remained troubled by engine fires and structural problems. Alternative designs like the four-engine He-277 or the Junkers Ju-390 never advanced beyond prototypes before Germany's collapse. The final accounting reveals Germany's strategic failure. By 1945, Britain had produced over 7,000 Avro Lancasters alone. America manufactured over 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 18,000 B-24 Liberators. These aircraft dropped approximately 2.5 million tons of bombs on Germany, destroying cities, infrastructure and industry while killing hundreds of thousands. Germany produced approximately 1,000 HE-177s, most grounded by technical problems. German bombers dropped roughly 75,000 tons of bombs on Britain, significant but not strategically decisive. So was Germany's failure to develop long-range strategic bombers stupid? The answer is nuanced. Given Germany's situation in the 1930s, the decisions made sense. Treaty restrictions had devastated aviation infrastructure. Industrial capacity was limited. Likely enemies were regional powers reachable by medium bombers. Existing heavy bomber technology was unproven. Resources were constrained. Doctrinal assumptions favoured tactical aviation supporting ground forces. These weren't stupid considerations but rational calculations based on available information and reasonable assumptions about future war. What proved stupid was continuing these policies after circumstances changed. When Britain became the enemy in 1938, Germany should have initiated crash-heavy bomber programs. When industrial warfare's scope became apparent in 1939, strategic priorities should have shifted. When the Soviet Union's depth became obvious in 1941, resources should have been allocated differently. Germany's failure wasn't the original decisions but the inability to adapt when assumptions proved wrong. The deepest lesson transcends aviation history. Germany entered World War II with doctrine, weapons and strategy, designed for the war German leaders wanted to fight, a short regional conflict against neighbouring powers where tactical superiority and operational excellence could achieve quick victory. They got instead a global total war against enemies with overwhelming industrial capacity, where strategic depth and production capacity determined outcomes. Medium bombers were perfect for the war Germany wanted. Heavy bombers were essential for the war Germany got. By the time German leaders understood the difference, British Lancasters and American Flying Fortresses were already reducing German cities to rubble, answering the question of strategic bombing's value with 2.5 million tons of high explosives. The young men who joined the Luftwaffe in 1935 believed they were building the world's most modern air force. They believed tactical excellence and operational brilliance would compensate for any material disadvantage. They believed wars were won by superior warriors, not superior factories. They watched their nation's cities burn under heavy bomber attacks they couldn't prevent or answer, and learned that in industrial warfare, production capacity ultimately trumps tactical brilliance. Germany's lack of heavy bombers wasn't stupid when decisions were made, it became stupid when circumstances changed and Germany couldn't adapt. That failure, written in burning cities from Hamburg to Berlin, stands as eternal warning that preparing for the war you want rather than the war you might get is the ultimate strategic stupidity, regardless of how rational initial assumptions appeared.